Hello, Lawrence. How are you doing?
Good, you?
Very good, thank you. Very good. Cool. All right. So the topic of the day, as we've discussed, is antinatalism, and you're coming at it from the angle of being uh, weirdly pro-antinatal, if that's even a phrase that can exist.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're kind of supporting antinatalism, which is it's been something that I've just recently come across. I've often heard people who say they don't want kids, but I've never heard of
Mm,
a kind of a philosophy, if you like, that's a more
yeah.
complete philosophy that really grapples with those ethics. So, Lawrence, if you wouldn't mind just doing a brief introduction, just on yourself, tell us a bit about you,
Mm.
and then maybe we'll dive into the topic.
Yeah, well, just a quick intro to me. Yeah, born and raised in London in the UK. I guess to give a bit of background that's relevant to antinatalism, I first came across the idea when I was on an exchange, like a university exchange in Uppsala in Sweden.
Oh, interesting.
I'd recently become vegan at the time, and um, that was a big mindset shift um, in my ethical concern towards animals. At that point in time, and still consider myself today very open-minded. But that was the first time I'd had a big shift in my worldview, and very soon after that, I heard about antinatalism, and I think my mind was quite sort of unusually open and sort of, to um, ideas that I'd never heard of before that were very counterintuitive. I overheard a conversation about antinatalism, and then through a series of events, just became more interested in it. Eventually, became convinced by it, and then a couple of years ago, started up a YouTube channel and been doing that since then. And I guess that's how you found me.
Okay. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that's exactly how I ran into you. It just popped into my
Mm,
feed effectively. Um, I thought some of your ideas were really interesting, very different. And I don't want to sound alarmist, but there was some concern there naturally.
mm,
I think you probably wouldn't disagree that at first glance it can be quite disconcerting to have someone tell you, oh, you shouldn't have kids.
yeah.
There's a bit of conflict there for us. So I also made the observation that you do come across as really well read. Did you study? Did you go to university? Is that part of the university exchange trip that you went on? Obviously.
Yeah, exactly. Although I didn't actually study anything that's particularly relevant to this, I studied environmental science. So it was
Okay.
much more science based than anything philosophical. I mean, maybe in one of the modules we did, we talked about what is the sort of philosophical nature of sustainability, how do you define it? But apart from that, it was much more learning about volcanoes, learning about the weather, policy, stuff like that. Um, but yeah,
Okay.
nonetheless, I've done a bit of reading.
Yeah, it does come across that way that you've done your research, especially around philosophy. You know, you invoke certain authors, which is really interesting. Perfect. Okay.
Mm,
So really, I wanted to start the line of questioning simply by asking you briefly, where does the origin story of antinatalism come from? You know, where does where what are the influences? Who are the key
mm.
philosophers? Um, yeah, kind of a brief history of where this idea comes from.
Yeah, so if anyone wants to go into this more in depth, although I'll give an overview now, I'll shamelessly plug a video on my channel called A Brief History of Antinatalism. But to give a brief overview now, so it's an idea that has been around, well, the the sort of foundations of the idea have been around for a long, long time. Um, some people tend to split it into sort of in the history into like proto-antinatalism and antinatalism. So proto-antinatalism is often like this sort of vague notion that it would have been better not to have been born. Um, eh, and then in the more modern sense, proper antinatalism is more this idea of like, yes, it would have been better to not to have been born, and it's unethical to reproduce as a result of that, right? But the general sort of idea has been around for a long time. So there's some semblance of it in ancient religions, or actually, to be honest, most religions around today will have some antinatalist ideas in them. Um, Even if those are held in tandem with some pronatalist ideas as well, so there are some religions who are quite pronatal, that are quite pronatalist, but also have some sort of like stories in their key text or whatever that also have antinatalist undertones. So Buddhism often comes to mind. Um, there's also, antinatalist sort of threads in Hinduism as well. And obviously, those both go back quite a long way. Ancient Greece as well. One of the most well known ancient poets that was very explicitly antinatalist was a poet called Al-Mari, who lived around 1,000 years ago in what would be Syria now.
Okay.
Um, and he was antinatalist to the extent where if you go and visit his grave today, which you still can do, on it it's written, "This is my father's crime done to me that I have done to no one," i.e., being my father created me and did this crime onto me, and I have had no children, so I've done the crime onto no one else. Um, and then more recently, obviously, this is a very whistle stop tour, but more recently, you have figures like Schopenhauer, who
Hmm.
often is seen not to be fully antinatalist, but he has very strong sort of antinatalist inclinations if he doesn't go the whole way. And then even more recently, you've got figures like David Benatar, who is still alive today, about to publish another book, not on antinatalism, but, alive and kicking, shall we say.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that. I picked up on a word that, forgive me, I've forgotten the Syrian poet's name. Could you just repeat that for
Al-Mari.
Al-Mari? He talks about on his gravestone, which is quite a poetic little phrase.
Mm.
Talks about it being a crime. Is that something that's present along the vein of antinatalism? That what we're doing to children by creating them in the first place is indeed a crime. Is it's an interesting. All I'm observing is that it's an
Mm.
interesting term to
Yeah.
choose.
Yeah. So obviously, the first thing to say is that um, like message above his uh, grave
Yeah.
wouldn't be in English. So that word crime is translated. So in the original translation, it might not exactly mean crime in how we understand it, but in terms of like referring to procreation as like a crime, obviously it means moral crime, not a legal crime, because
Sure. Yeah, I get that. Yeah.
I'm not aware of anywhere where it is a crime. And, maybe you could say like in China when they had the one child policy, certain, births were considered a crime. But yeah, it means moral crime. I, you know, if there are certain antinatalists being more sort of like colorful or poetic or whatever in their language, they would refer to it as a crime. Um, it's I've I've got to say it being referenced as a crime is not like an extremely common thing. It's just generally referenced as like immoral, but sometimes that terminology is invoked. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Because I noticed when I was watching through your videos, and I watched every one of your shorts and several of your debates, which was really interesting. You
Mm.
didn't invoke that kind of language, so it was interesting to me that one of the, I don't know if founding father is really the right terminology, but at least an old influence, right, an
Yeah.
ancient
Yeah.
influence. It's interesting that that terminology is used, but if it's kind of lost in ancient translation in presumably something like Aramaic or whatever the language of the time was in that region, then that's fine. Interesting though. Cool. Um, if we can segue nicely onto what other what's the framework that you're working for? Is there a kind of like I don't know how to word this really. Is there an ethical framework or a moral framework that
Mm.
you're operating from that then informs antinatalism? What occurs before? Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. 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 So I don't think there is like any one specific moral framework that someone has to have to be an antinatalist. I think you can adopt any moral framework and it can lead to antinatalism. Um, or it can not lead to antinatalism. Like
Sure.
I think all moral frameworks can or cannot lead to antinatalism, depending on how you evaluate certain like facts of life and things like this, or the information you have at your disposal. Um, so yeah, I would say it can flow from any. In terms of like me individually, or how I've sort of seen other antinatalists, I would say there's not really been any sort of concrete surveys, but I would say it's pretty mixed. There are quite a lot of antinatalists who are utilitarian or consequentialist, if you want to use a more broad term. But then there are also more deontological or rules-based antinatalists as well, who just say no, birth is just or creating someone is just an unethical thing to do, regardless of the consequences. So there is a mixture. For me, to be honest, I I find it quite hard to pin myself down. I I sort of and this annoys some people, but I often sort of play both arenas. Like I do see procreation as unethical in and of itself, but I can also recognize the consequences that may come downstream of it. So I'm not like um, I wouldn't consider myself like dogmatic about it. If there was some extreme case where, and obviously this is not like practical, but it's just to give an example. If someone were to come up to me and, say, you must have a child or I am going to, take, the whole country of, I don't know, Brazil hostage and kill them. Obviously, I'm going to have the kid. Um,
Yeah. Okay.
but
That's
yeah,
good to hear.
in general, I see it like how many other people would see other ethical issues, right? Like stealing is wrong, but if the consequences are such that there's so much overwhelming sort of like counter consideration, then you might be like a bit lenient. Um, so yeah, I sort of treat it as I would many other moral issues.
Okay. Cool. Fine. Well, that's helpful, especially from your perspective, to kind of sort of understand where you're coming from.
Mm.
That's great. So, what are the arguments that you use to kind of explain antinatalism? What are the for example, what you talk a lot about creating life brings about harm. There's an inherent immoral. There's an injustice to it.
Mm.
Can you just dive into that a little bit more? Kind of help us, inform the audience as to what those arguments are. What's the harm in creating life?
Yeah, sure. So when talking about the arguments for antinatalism, there are like two main categories of argument, and I'm more of a fan of the first one that I'll go over, which is so the first category of what is what's called philanthropic arguments. So basically, these are arguments for antinatalism that concern the being you're creating. There's a second category of argument which is somewhat misleadingly called the misanthropic set of arguments. Now, it doesn't mean misanthropic in terms of like a hatred of humans, um, but it means uh, upon creating someone, the impact that is going to have on others. If you're following my drift, so I'll go back to the
Okay.
first.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll go
Yeah.
back to the first category first. So this category is where I sort of like primarily ground my like antinatalist views. So yeah, there are like there are a range of philanthropic arguments for antinatalism. I'll cover like the three main ones that are sort of like most commonly invoked or employed. So the first, perhaps most well known, is called the axiological asymmetry of harms and benefits. So basically, the easiest way I find to explain it is um, there are very widely held and quite deeply intuitive beliefs that we have that are fairly commonplace in society about the nature of harms and benefits with regards to bringing someone into existence. So, to give you an example, imagine there's a couple who gets screened, genetically when they're about, when the prospective mother is pregnant. They want to, they don't make sure they're not carrying any recessive genes or anything like this for some sort of genetic abnormality. And it turns out they actually are carrying some of those. And so the child is almost guaranteed to have a certain condition that's going to mean they're going to lead quite a bad life by anyone's standards. Most people would look at this case and say, that's a reason not to create that child. That would be a bad thing to do, to create that child. If you take the sort of opposite example, and you have a couple on the other side of the aisle who also get screened, and there's another genetic abnormality, but this time it's actually going to very likely result in the child having a condition where they would have actually an amazing life, a very good life. Most people would say that, like, yeah, it would be good once the child exists that they have a good life, but that's not a reason to create the child, right? Because if they fail to create the child, there's no one who would exist to be deprived of that life. So it gives a moral permission, but not a moral reason to create the child.
Okay, I understand.
So, yeah. So, obviously, our lives are much more complicated than this. We don't just have pure bliss or pure misery. We have a mixture, right? Of much of our life is mediocre. I don't know if you want to wait for him to come back.
We'll carry on. He's clearly having some tech issues.
Okay, cool.
You'll have to forgive us. Unfortunately, it's
No, it's all
we've been
good.
plagued by IT. So
No, it's all good. Do you
so
just want me to continue?
yeah, let's get back on your analogy. So you just mentioned how our lives aren't really distilled down to just
Exactly,
good
yeah.
and just bad. It's a mediocre, and you were just making the point that actually most of our life is mediocre, and I broadly agree with that. Um,
Yeah. So, yeah, exactly. So compared to those extremes, most of our lives are fairly mediocre with some sort of peaks and troughs, right? Of like, a bit worse or quite a lot worse, or a bit better or quite a lot better. Um, but I think the same principles tend to apply. The sort of goodness in life, or the benefits, or the happiness. Again, it's a moral permission, but it's not a moral reason to create someone. Whereas the negative things in life, these are a moral reason not to create someone. Would it be a bad thing to impose on someone? And so if you put those two things together, a permission and a reason against, then overall you get this reason against creating someone. So that's the first one. There's this sort of asymmetry between creating people to lead happy lives and creating people that would lead miserable lives. Um, there's also the consideration that obviously all of this is done without consent. So in pretty much every aspect of our lives, we see consent as quite an important moral force, right? So
yeah. Especially when it
sex
comes to
without
children, I would say as well. We
exactly,
define
yeah,
our sexual practices around ages of consent. This is a
exactly, yes,
super important thing, and obviously sexual behaviour as broadly speaking, between consenting adults is very important. Sorry, I didn't mean
yeah.
to interject, but
No,
I
no. So yeah, example you touch on, yeah. I mean, exactly. You touch on one of the examples I was going to use. So like, sex is with consent. If you remove consent, you've obviously then got, I won't use the word, but the R word, because if you're going
yeah.
to put this on YouTube, it might trigger it.
Thank you.
Um, and then yeah, you've got work. Obviously anti-capitalists may
Oh, they'll
argue a bit
disagree.
about this,
They'll
but
disagree.
yeah,
Yeah.
but in general we consent to work. We voluntarily go to a job. But if you remove consent from that, obviously that then turns into slavery. So obviously consent is a very important moral force here, right?
Sure.
um, and when it comes to procreation, obviously the child cannot consent to be born. This is impossible. It's a prerequisite to exist to be able to give consent.
I would
So
agree
any
with
of
you. Yeah. The
yeah,
creating I agree that creating a child, you kind of you impose that upon them. Whether
mm,
and I would argue that there is an inherent good to impose a life,
mm,
because I find that creating life is a beautiful thing, and I kind of
mm.
get the sense that we're leading up to that. For you, that's an immoral thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm completely happy to get into that. I can quickly cover the third one, and then we can
Sorry.
dive in. No.
I'm
It's
getting
all
excited, you see.
no. It's all good. It's all
It's-
good. So and then the third one I'll cover is called the risk argument. So basically, this is the argument that even if you see creating people as a good thing, which it sounds like you do, um, there are a selection of cases where we can pretty much all agree that it would be wrong to create those people. So these are people that we would reflect on having like very bad lives, right? So this could include children born into war zones or children,
Hmm.
born who get cancer or develop cancer in the very early years of their life, and it ravages their body, and then they die after a short period of being alive. These are lives that generally all of us would agree are pretty horrible and no one should be subjected to. And the risk argument says, even if you see it as a good thing to create people in general, the fact that you're running the risk on someone else's behalf that they may end up in that category, and there's no guarantee that you can make to them that they won't end up in that category, that's enough of a reason not to create someone. Because if you don't take that gamble, then the child simply won't exist. They won't be losing out on any of the goods or anything like that, because they won't exist. They don't. It's not like they're there waiting to get into existence or anything like that. So those are like the three sort of main philanthropic arguments. So yeah.
Okay, cool. So I think I want to kind of unpack the moral good versus the immoral for creating
Mm,
life, because for me, whilst your philosophical standpoint makes sense, you put forward a good argument, and I'm not a debater. I haven't read
mm.
philosophy in any meaningful way. My
Yeah.
extent of reading philosophy was reading Marx when I was a disaffected youth.
Yeah.
So that's about the extent for me. However, for me there is an innate value to life, and I extend that value to all life. It's not just human
Mm,
life, but I do feel as though there is an inherent um, intrinsic value to human life. And like I said, I extend that to all life on planet Earth. I think
mm,
there is almost a miracle-like quality to life, and but then I agree with you that there are some lives that are subjected to just the most abject horrors that a human being could experience.
mm,
Being a child growing up in a war-torn country, I think what's going on in Ukraine and Palestine currently is probably the most um, tenable like example that you could come up with. Kids that have had their homes blown apart.
mm,
I see what you're saying. However, when I brought my kids into the world, I was pretty sure that the world was going to be for them a pretty stable place, and I was
mm,
able to offer them a really good life and a happy life. I revel in seeing smiles on their little faces,
mm,
and I know that's a very selfish outlook, right? That I'm getting a kick out of their the good that they experience, but they're such happy little creatures that I can't
mm,
help but feel empathy towards their joy.
mm,
So for me to reject that, turn my back on that, would be well, put it this way, it would be counterintuitive for me.
mm,
I would feel that that's wrong somehow. How does
mm,
that vibe with you? Like I'm just doing. I don't even know how to argue my side here, because you come at this from such a strong framework, and I'm just going on feels
mm.
that
Well,
I don't even have the vocabulary to explain myself here. Do
yeah.
you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, I would just because you were saying, you'd find it very counterintuitive to like turn your back on their happiness. What did you mean by turning your back?
So okay, so for me to adopt the way that you're thinking, I would
Mm,
ultimately have to reject the very essence of fatherhood, for example, because I told you in our prep time that I'm a father of four, so the most
mm,
beautiful kids that one could ever be blessed with. They're truly incredible children. They've been blessed with all the hallmarks of a perfect human being. They look fantastic. They're beautiful in a physical sense, but they also got beautiful minds. And so for me to have somehow thought that I could deny that, um, I don't know. It just feel that's what I'm coming from. That
mm.
I feel as though I'm turning my back on my own
Yeah.
creation.
Yeah, I can get so like um one sort of
You're gonna have to
interesting
seal
thing.
man here for me, because you know I'm not prepared for this. You know, I came
Well,
to
no, but
you I'm coming at you from a normie perspective. Let's put it
yeah,
that
yeah,
way.
yeah, yeah. No, so like an interesting thing to insert here is that there are actually antinatalist parents. So there are
Sure, yeah,
parents, yeah, there are parents who become antinatalist after having their children. And again, I have two interviews with parents on my channel. If you you know would like to watch those, but they universally sort of express a love for their children, right?
yeah,
And yeah, they they love their kids. They think they're magical. They would not do anything to um, they would not even though they now look back on I guess a good way to describe it is like there's two forms of regret, I guess, right? So the way I would understand how an antinatalist parent would relate to their child is that they don't regret having their child in their life because they love their child, they have a relationship with their child, they want to see the best happen for their child. But they regret creating the child, right? They realize it was something they shouldn't have done, but
oof,
since it has been done, um, they love their child for who they are. They want to do the best by them. They want the best for them. All of that sort of stuff. Because antinatalism isn't about in any way demonizing children or hating
no,
children. Once they're here, once a child is here, they're here. We need to give them the best run at life as we can. Antinatalism is concerned with not starting lives. So once a child exists, their life is already started. So antinatalism really has no opinion about them. Or it shouldn't anyway. If there are antinatalists that hate children, I think that's idiotic. It's childish. It doesn't follow from antinatalism. It's something independent of it. Um, but yeah, so that's the first thing to say. The second thing I would say is that I can completely understand where you're coming from in that it's very hard to um, to sort of entertain the idea of antinatalism in the context of having, especially four children that you love, right? Because um, it is asking you essentially to accept the fact that you did something wrong, which led to something that you see as so positive, right?
sure, yeah.
And
That's
yeah,
and
and
that's that's the point I was trying to make, and thank you for better vocalizing it.
no,
That's
it's all good.
exactly it. It's almost as if there's, yeah. You've explained it beautifully. I'll concede.
No, no. So, and I can completely understand that. Um, I think the way, I guess maybe like the easiest way to understand it is that you know the happiness that your children experience in their lives now, and I hope they go on to experience as much happiness as possible. Um, that happiness is only of value to them given that they exist, right? So the good life that you are, by the sounds of it, providing them is only needed by them because they exist. I'll give like another example, right? So um if I were to say, I want to have a good retirement, a nice retirement, that would make sense. I exist here now, I'm going to need a retirement at some point, so it's good that it will be a nice retirement. But it wouldn't make sense for me to say I'm going to create a child so that they can have a nice retirement as well, because they would only need the retirement once I've created them. And I kind of see it as the same with like creating someone to have a good life, right? Like it's good that us three have good lives since we exist, but to create someone else so that they can have a good life is very counterintuitive to me. And it doesn't make sense because the only reason they would need the good life is because we've created them in the first place. So it's almost like we're creating them to need a good life, giving them a good life, and then patting ourselves on the back for solving a deprivation that we instilled in them in the first place, if you get what I mean.
Sort of, yeah. I do understand where you're coming from. It's almost like
Mm,
a circular argument. It's almost as if we're creating good lives for the sake of creating good lives at that point. Um,
exactly, yeah.
yeah, it's a difficult quandary to kind of to grapple with, especially just fairly recent within the last couple of days. I reached out. It was only a short while ago that I
Mm,
stumbled across this. Um, Yeah.
But can I just ask, out of interest, like, how did you first hear about antinatalism? Was it
Okay.
one of my videos, or had you heard about it before and then found one of my videos?
It was actually it was actually the it was Musk that had tweeted about it at some point
Right. Yeah.
in recent times, and he took a fairly negative view, as you can probably assume, given
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
given his video with Jordan Peterson, which came out, what was it, yesterday?
Yeah.
Um, so, and instinctively, I tend to agree with his worldview. I tend to agree
Mm,
that making human beings is a good thing.
mm,
And you, but the thing is that I also recognise that there's an inherent risk. It's almost as if there's a parental lottery involved with making kids. Um, it's inherently risky. Not all parents are going to be good parents. Not all
mm,
nations that a kid is born in is going to be stable and be conducive with a good life. It might even be dangerous or racked with crime. Those kind of things, and it's almost as if not. It's not even. I don't even want to talk about those things because they're so hard to even talk about. The
mm.
poor experiences a child can have. It can be very depressing.
Yeah, no, 100%. And one quote that comes to mind, which I'm gonna I'm not gonna get it exactly verbatim, um, but it's by a philosopher I mentioned before, David Benatar. So if you're looking to read a book on this topic, I would say his book, Better Never to Have Been, is the best book on the topic. So if you're a reader, I'd highly recommend that. But there's one quote from that book which I find um, very motivating for me, which is um, many good people go to great lengths to protect their children from coming to harm, but fail to realize that the only guaranteed way to make sure they come to no harm is simply not to create them in the first place. Um, and to me, that's quite a sort of like profound quote, because I see in our culture this sort of pronouncement that we want to take care of children, protect children from harm, which is obviously very understandable. I have the same view. And yet, the only reason there are children coming to harm is because we're pursuing our own selfish desires of wanting to have children, are putting them in harm's way. And it seems to me like, we would do anything to protect a child from harm apart from sacrifice our own desire to create the child and not put them in harm's way in the first place, if you get what I mean.
I do, and this is where I would push back a bit.
Mm,
Um, is it not better to pursue the fight in making the world a better place for children rather than just say let's not bother? Because
mm,
for me, I don't know. I find that kids are worth fighting for. Um, I I if we were to take the scenario of we can't reproduce, for example, there's I don't know, some
mm.
sort of a virus that stops us all from reproducing, and the world finds itself in very much like a Children of Men, right,
Yeah,
or
yeah, yeah,
Handmaid's Tale.
yeah.
We are beset by a plague that stops us from reproducing kids. What a sad and lonely, dark place that would be to not experience the joy of children anymore. It, I
Mm,
would even beg the question of why would we not just all suddenly just commit seppuku and just be done with it, speed up the end, because a world without children is a world not having. Because to not hear
mm,
the sound of children playing in the playground again would just be, for me, unbearable. To not have
mm,
a house full of, well, presumably they'd grow up. My kids would grow up to be older, so that wouldn't be an issue. But the thought of couples not being able to procreate and fill their house with joy would just, I don't know. It's a very bleak prospect. So,
mm.
is the world a world that's currently full of kids, because it is, not worth fighting for to make it better rather than to abandon creation altogether? Do you see where I'm coming
Yes.
from?
Yeah, 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 100%. So I think I would advocate for doing both, right? So I would advocate people not bring any more people into existence, but also recognize that there are already people in existence. And despite my best efforts, people will continue to bring children into existence. So
I hope
I
so.
think we need to do both, right? So just it, it you know take any issue like I don't know, a horrible issue like child trafficking, right? So I would say, obviously, the ultimate way to end child trafficking is don't create any more children because then there's no more potential victims. But that's kind of like a naive answer when you take into account the fact that there are already children here, and so child trafficking will continue, even if I'm trying to make some ideological point. So I think we need to do both, right? Like I would encourage people not to reproduce, but also I think we should pursue making issues that already exist in the world better or alleviating those issues, right? Um, and I can completely understand your point about, thinking forward to a world where if humans did all stop reproducing, which obviously won't happen, but if humans did stop reproducing, it would, for a sort of temporary period of roughly one generation, create this very sort of like solemn landscape, of sort of people essentially like on death row, or like our species is on death row
Yeah.
basically. There's no more new beings coming into existence, and those who are around are simply trying to um uh basically undergo like managed decline, trying to do the best they can with each other, and then ultimately die out, and then there's no one around anymore. So once you get to the point where the human species is extinct, there's no one around, then I wouldn't consider that a bad thing because there's no one around to consider it a bad thing. The bad section would be that section between everyone stops reproducing and finally we're extinct. So the last person dies, hopefully in a peaceful way. Um, so that sort of period of there being a last generation, I 100%, agree. That's going to be a time fraught with distress. It's going to be aesthetically very harsh, and it's going to contain probably quite a lot of suffering, unless we're very considered about it and we put technology in place to support the last generation, which may be something which may happen one day. Um, so I fully accept that. The two things I would say though are, the first one is that one day we will have a last generation. The human species are not going to go on forever, right? Even
Granted.
if
Yeah.
yeah, even if it's just the heat death of the universe, at some point humans will come to an end. And so I would submit that it would be better for us to manage our own decline and be considered in how we go extinct than to leave it up to some sort of natural disaster, or that we blow each other up, or we go extinct via some, war or something like that. The second thing I would say is you've got to consider um, the sort of counterfactual scenario of, okay, yes, if humans manage their own decline and go extinct, this, is very sad in aesthetically, and also sad like sentimentally. There will be a lot of suffering in the last generation, but what are we comparing it to? We're not comparing it to a blissful society. We're comparing it to a society where if we don't go extinct, new people are constantly going to be brought into existence, and there will always be people with depression. There will always be people in brutal accidents. There likely will always be war. I know some people are very optimistic about human nature and that we'll overcome these things. You know, I'm not so optimistic. But we've sort of seen throughout history that as we solve one issue, another can present itself, right? Um, so a few other things like cancer is rife, depression is rife, suicide is the seventh leading, I believe, killer around the world. I believe it still is the cause of more death than war is, although I know there's more conflict starting up recently, so maybe that will change. So that's the alternative that we've got to compare it to, if you get what I mean. But yeah, there's a few sort of
It seems.
points.
Yeah. It seems rather nebulous. There's Yeah. Okay. Um. Fine. There's lots there that I concede on as well.
Mm,
I totally agree that there will one day
mhm,
cease to be life on Earth, which is it's almost poetically depressing. It's
Mm.
like one day, this war will end.
Yeah.
But then for me, it begs the question of, well, what's the point of being here? Why are we here in the first place? If there is an
Mm.
answer to such a question, and does phasing us out, even if we're managing that ceasing to exist, I almost want to ask: do we have the right to make that kind of decision?
Mm.
And I know you're operating from an ethical or a moral framework or a philosophy, but I don't know. It feels like we're kind of playing with an unknown,
Mm.
a universal unknown. I'm not sure that we are the ones to decide that.
Mm.
And I'm
So.
appealing to mystical powers.
Mm. Mm.
I really am. I'm
No, no,
invoke.
no. Yeah. Yeah, no, I get it. I still look, I'm also human, obviously. I have strong sentimental attachments to many of the things that humans do. I live an ordinary life outside of doing the YouTube channel, so
Of course, yeah.
so it's like I apart from the stuff you see online that I do, I'm a normal person that goes about my business and stuff. So I also have the like sentimental attachments to many of the things that humanity does and is, and I think there are many wonderful things that we do, like bringing joy to children who are here. There's is there anything more beautiful than seeing a child just in pure bliss and amazement, right? With a smile on their face,
Mm.
in complete innocence. They haven't been tainted by, the existential considerations that adults have, taxes, the issues going on in the world. They can just live in the moment in pure bliss and stuff. This is like it's an amazing thing to observe. So I 100% get where you're coming from, but for me, um, the suffering that will be prevented is just more important. Um, if if I so when we create a generation, we're creating children who will experience that stuff, but we're also creating children who will experience very negative stuff, right? And all of the children we create will experience some negative stuff, and ultimately all of them will die as well, obviously. Not as children, but everyone dies, obviously. Um,
Mhm.
and I don't see that trade-off as worth it. I don't know if you've heard of the story of the ones who walk away from Omelas, but very shortly, it's basically just
Yeah.
this it's this short story about an amazing city where everyone has amazing lives, apart from one child in a basement who just lives a life of agony and torture, right? And torment. And the idea is it worth having that, is it justified having that city of amazement given that it is sourced from that agony in that one child? And a lot of people would say, no, that's messed up. That child should not have to pay so that everyone else can have a happy life. And the way I see it is like every time we create a generation, we're doing that, except there are loads of children who will end up in cancer wards or blown up in war zones or having chronic depression, and they're the cost for the rest of the people in that generation being created, not to live blissful lives, but mostly mediocre lives. Do you get what I mean? So it's like we're not in Omelas,
Mhm.
we're in like a much shitter version of Omelas. Um,
Okay. Yeah,
yeah.
I see what you're saying. When you say they're the cost, though, what do you mean by they're the cost? Because it's not as if we benefit from their misery or their pain or their suffering.
Yes. So what I mean is, when we sort of collectively create a new generation, because obviously it's not one person who creates a whole generation, but many people taking part in that act. We know as a fact of the matter that as we create a new generation, some of those children will lead very bad lives. Most of them will lead, average, moderate lives, and some will lead very good lives. And given that we're making the decision to create that new generation, we're accepting those children as like the cost that's paid to be able to create the whole generation and have those kids leading the happy lives, if you get what I mean. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sort
Yeah,
of.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think I spectrum.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know, say I have like 100 bottles of water, and five of them have laxative in. and you know, I'm choosing to give. This is obviously a ridiculous example, but I'm choosing to give away all 100 bottles of water. 95 people are going to, you know, get those bottles of water and enjoy them, and 5 are just going to end up shitting themselves for the next few hours, right? So those 5 people would be bearing the cost for the 95 people. It's not
Okay.
a perfect analogy, but it's just a simple one to prove the point.
I get the hypothetical. I
Yeah.
really do. Sorry, Robert. Did you want to jump in?
No, yeah, I was going to ask a personal question.
Go
It
for it,
was,
mate.
do you ever express regret at your own birth in your own personal life?
So it's interesting you say that, because one of the recent videos I made was how do I view my own birth. So basically, I, on an intellectual level, think that it would have been better never to have come into existence. So I think on an intellectual level, it would have been better if I was never born. But I don't like really attach any emotion to that. Like, I don't lament my own birth. I don't hate my parents for it. You know, I don't live my life in, you know, actively focusing on it or thinking about it. Like, I'm here. I'm now going to try and have the best time I can. I'm going to try and live my life in a way where I can improve the situation for others. So I do a lot of like animal rights work as well. Um, so yeah, that's kind of how I view my own birth. Like, on an intellectual level, I think it was a bad thing, but on an emotional level, I'm just kind of like neutral to it.
Yeah, and my other question, my follow-up was going to be, is your belief then that there's nothing and then life and then nothing again? No form of afterlife?
So that's an interesting one. So all I would say is that I haven't come across any good reason to believe there's anything before or after the life we're experiencing now. I'm
Hmm.
open to, like, I'm kind of agnostic on whether there is. Like, ultimately I don't know. Ultimately, I don't think any of us know if there is an
Yeah,
afterlife or something before. But if I'm just taking the knowledge that I have, um, you know, my best judgment is that I don't know, basically. Yeah.
yeah, because a lot of faiths say that the suffering part is the life, and the eternal blissfulness comes after life.
Mm.
So it's when you're saying we're in a shitty version, could it be that we have to suffer through this first in order to become eternally blissful?
Yeah.
That would be my follow-up.
Yeah. So
Um,
I've got no like knockdown argument saying that that is wrong, but how it comes across to me is that it's just a heavy dose of cope, if that makes sense. Of like,
mhm,
you know, the way I see it is ultimately our lives have no purpose. We can create purpose for ourselves, but ultimately there is no reason for us being here. And there is a lot of suffering in the world which is just egregious and, you know, has no purpose or justification. You know, like, when a
yeah,
kid is born and they do lead a horrible life, they're abused by some asshole, there is no purpose to that, right? And sometimes perpetrators of injustice will get away with it. And
yeah,
ultimately, I believe there is no ultimate justice they will come to. Um, and so I think it's understandable that supernatural beliefs about an afterlife of ultimate justice and ultimate blissfulness are going to come around as a form of cope of us making sense of the world, because we have evolved these very complex minds that want to seek patterns and want to see justice be done, and want to be comforted. And it just seems like a natural consequence of that we're going to come up with these ideas about an afterlife with ultimate justice and bliss.
mhm.
Um, I know people see that as a condescending way to dismiss that sort of worldview, but that is just how it honestly comes across to me. That's not to say it's wrong. It may be right, and I might be wrong, but that's how it comes across to me.
Yeah, it's an
Yeah, I agree with you actually.
interesting take. Interesting take. Um, do you mind if I jump in now, Rob?
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna ask you, Lawrence, what does your utopia look like? What's the ideal? Where does your version of antinatalism? Presumably, it's relatively subjective to a point.
Mm.
What does your ideal world look like?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of different ways I guess you could answer this, right? So if you're strictly talking an antinatalist utopia, then it would simply just be no more beings are brought into existence. We're not bringing anyone else into existence. That would be like the antinatalist utopia, um, because antinatalism doesn't really make any judgment about lives once they exist. So the utopia for antinatalism would simply be no more people brought into existence. Um, Obviously, that doesn't mean it would be a general utopia, because then the people in existence may not have very good lives. So it wouldn't be a utopia in that sense, but it would be an antinatalist utopia, because antinatalism has kind of achieved everything it wants. Um, if I would um, if I were to communicate my personal utopia, I would say there are two versions of it. Um, the first version is that there are no more beings brought into existence, and everyone who already exists has an amazing life, right? That would be one utopia. The other utopia, which it may be very counterintuitive that I pair these two together, but the other utopia would simply be like Mars. There is just a planet with no life on it. Um, and I would be indifferent between those two.
Not even non-human life, as in just devoid of life.
Yeah, just devoid of life, and I would be indifferent towards those two. And the reason being is that um, Mars has a massive advantage over Earth, in that the fact there's no life on it means there's no suffering, there's no harm going on. No one looks at Mars and goes, um, you know, there should be suffering there. No one looks at a space where there's nothing wrong going on, there's no harm being done, and says we should introduce harm there. Um, but I don't think, given that Mars doesn't have any life, someone could also say, well, isn't it bad that there's no happiness? And I, I just don't see that it as bad that there's no happiness there. Going back to the asymmetry that I spoke about before, in that, happiness may give a permission to create someone, but not a reason. In that, given that Mars is just devoid of life, there's no one there to want the happiness. So if Mars was, this utopia with people on it, then it would be the first one I said, where I hope they have amazing lives, right? But if those people never came into existence, there would be no harm done. They wouldn't be there to lament the fact they didn't be deprived of this happiness. So those are kind of like two utopias that I would kind of be indifferent towards.
Okay, all right. It's
What if we could, though? What if, as humanity, could use or generate like a digital Garden of Eden, for example, and have you
Mm.
live there? Would that take away the suffering?
Yeah,
If
I
that, I
mean,
no, sorry, no, no, that's not the question. If that took away the suffering, would that be also a possible utopia?
mm. So do you mean almost like in Inception, where they sort of hook you up to something and you live in a
Yes.
dream world?
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, if we came up with a technology where you could be hooked up to a dream world and that's your reality, and it was amazing, there was no suffering in it, um,
Hmm.
then yeah, that would effectively, for all intents and purposes, be the utopia. So that would be, yeah, the first utopia I spoke about. The only like practical consideration I would say, though, which would apply to any utopia, is that, and I think this is one of the flaws in utopian thinking generally, is that um, once you achieve a utopia, they can be extremely hard to maintain. So that is one reason I would actually prefer Mars over the utopia where everyone lives amazing lives, because we may get to the point where you have this utopia where everyone lives amazing lives, but who's to say that that's going to be maintained, right? That may happen for a few generations, but then what if people have disagreements? What if the technology fails? What if the structures
Hmm.
break down? This sort of stuff. So, yeah, in a philosophical sense, I'm indifferent between them, but in a practical sense, I'd prefer the Mars example, because it's safer. Like, there's no one in existence to be a victim.
Or
Yeah.
anything either, right? So
Anything, yeah,
we're
anything in
talking about
existence.
single celled life as well. Um, so question, kind of both of you really, because you're kind of both touching on, you know, a blissful existence, either through a digital means, a fake reality, a matrix-like existence, and both as in a biological bliss. You know, say that we have these, Earth becomes paradise and there's no more suffering known. For me, there's almost an intrinsic suffering built into life. Even at the most basic form, we know that single-celled organisms, whilst they don't experience hunger like we do, they certainly go and pursue food. You know, and when there's a scarcity of it, they obviously die off. They go through a natural life and death cycle. They don't live. And even if you made our existence as delightful as possible, we're still going to feel things like a cold night or a not having had food immediately because instead of going shopping, we went for a run in our blissful existence. So it's almost as if suffering is built into life, would be one point. And also to have a successful life, you need to have suffered at least a bit. It seems to be intrinsic to our evolution. Would you agree with that? Like to be alive, you have to suffer a bit.
Yeah, I agree with that. So like, it's often like interesting to discuss hypothetical scenarios like we were just doing. But yeah, it's always good to bring it back down to reality in that like there is always inherently some suffering in life, you know. One idea, you know, because like unless someone has like some religious worldview, although they should still accept evolution, like we are here because we evolved alongside other animals, other life forms, and we evolved into humans, right?
Yeah.
And evolution serves our genes. It doesn't serve us as individuals, right? And
Right.
so we've evolved to be motivated rather than, you know, motivated enough to get to the age and to be able to reproduce, right? So we've evolved to be motivated, not satiated. And so given our fundamental sort of design, as it were, even though I don't believe there was a designer, you know, unsatisfaction and suffering, I believe, is an inherent part of life. Now, there are certain projects like transhumanism which are approaching the sort of topic of abolishing suffering and trying to manipulate our genes. But obviously, even that comes with its risks of like, if you come up with the technology to be able to abolish suffering genetically, well, what if that technology falls into the wrong hands? Then you've basically handed the keys to the human genome to some dictator or you know, bad actor. But yeah, I agree with you. I think suffering is inherent in life, and that's because yeah, we've evolved to serve our genes rather than be satisfied and content individuals.
Cool. Okay. So I'm glad we sort of agree on that. In fact, completely agree. And so to follow up on that, um, I would be concerned if we managed to figure out a way to completely eradicate all suffering, either through a technological means or through an alternate reality, through some sort of VR or whatever. I would be concerned because it's almost as if you need some bad, no matter how small. You need to maybe feel you know, anger towards someone, or you know, feel a heartbreak, or feel loss, in order to recognize the good. Otherwise, then good becomes almost meaningless. It's a bit like if you overplay a video game or you binge watch a bunch of films, you suddenly feel empty at the end because you don't have the dopamine release, or you've experienced too much dopamine. Maybe I'm not a biologist or a biochemist, I don't understand, but anecdotally I know that too much of a good thing is a thing. A simple example would be if you, like I have, spent the last 10 years with my missus almost unseparated, not even a night away. You know, it's quite rare that we ever, you know, have a night away. It'll be me for work, I'll stay in a hotel. It's almost as if having that moment of loss, that heartache, brings everything back to, makes everything real again. Does that make sense? So I would be concerned that creating a blissful existence with no bad whatsoever would actually be a bad thing somehow, unintuitively or counterintuitively. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, I can understand that, and to bring it back to antinatalism, basically what you're kind of talking about there, at least how I understand it, is like the instrumental value of suffering, right? So like
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
suffering in and of itself may not be good, but it can provide an instrumental value that helps us achieve something else, right? So you spending a night away from your partner, whilst your experience of the separation or the loneliness or the longing, that may not be a positive feeling in and of itself, but it produces a deeper richness in your relationship, right? Because you're more engaged once you're back with her. So yeah, that's completely understandable. Yeah, and I also identify with that. Like, I think once we exist, that there is a certain character to certain types of suffering that can be beneficial, like going to the gym as well. Obviously, it's a form of suffering we go through, and you get stronger from it. How that relates to antinatalism, though, is that I think that form of suffering can be good once we exist, but it's not a reason to create someone. And I'll give an example. So, like the gym example. So, yeah, since I exist, it's good that I elect to go to the gym and get stronger, because it makes me feel better, or it makes it easier for me to do certain tasks in my life. But those benefits are only of value to me because I already exist. So if I were to say
Right.
I'm going to have a child so that they can go to the gym and get better at performing tasks that they will need to do once they exist, that wouldn't make as much sense, because the only reason they are in need of that instrumental value is because you created them in the first place.
I
The
understand.
other,
Yeah.
yeah, the other thing to say is the the suffering that can be instrumental to us. Um, some of it isn't voluntary, but we can voluntarily elect to take on suffering, because we know there may be some reward, like going to the gym. We voluntarily go because we know it will maybe bring about some reward. Whereas with procreation, the suffering is one person putting it on another person. Um, so there's another distinction there, in that one form of suffering is voluntary, the other is being imposed involuntary. Yeah.
I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. I wasn't. It's clever that you linked it back to antinatalism. That was, but I hadn't gone that far down the road. I was just trying to think of reasons why you may not want to have a world without suffering.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool. Okay, that makes sense. So, if we've understood what your utopia, kind of broadly speaking, looks like, it's either Mars or, blissful existence, then what are your prescriptions? How do you get there?
So, I mean, I have no idea what a detailed path would be to get there. I think it's not always, but it's generally quite naive for any of us to think that we have the knowledge to be, or capacity to be able to pursue such a thing. I'm more of a fan of a more practical approach to solving problems, in that we should solve the problems that we can now. In sort of, have either of you come across Thomas Sowell?
I'm a massive fan of Thomas Sowell.
Okay,
I've read a
so
number of his books.
yeah, so you'll know his quote: "There are no solutions, only trade-offs." Right.
Right.
So, this utopia, right, is a solution that I'm putting forward, or someone's putting forward. But in reality, I don't think there are any solutions. There are only trade-offs, and so we've got to use the resources we have now to alleviate the issues that are currently in existence, and we expect may come into existence. I think that's a more sort of like down-to-earth, reasonable approach. So, my prescriptions there would be, if I was like a member of government, there would be a whole range of things that I would do. So, just as a couple of examples, in my foreign aid, I would increase the proportion of that goes to providing contraception in places that don't currently have it. I would, have comprehensive education around contraception at an appropriate age in school. I would make ethics a mandatory subject in school, because every single person interacts with other people, so ethics is relevant to all of us. Um, I think ethics is more relevant to the average person than trigonometry is, and yet trigonometry gets taught in schools and ethics
I
is
don't
not
know
a
why.
mandatory subject.
I don't know why we get
Yeah.
exposed to trigonometry. That's a suffering that I could do without.
Exactly. Yeah. So, another thing I would do is like, yeah, make ethics mandatory. Another thing that I'm generally in support of, I don't know exactly how it should be implemented, but one thing I'm generally in support of is some sort of mandatory course that any prospective parent would have to go on, so that they can be more informed about how to raise a child responsibly.
Ooh, okay.
So, this would include like basic financial literacy, conflict resolution, communication skills, basic cooking, um, all at first aid. All of these are things that the average person would benefit from anyway. But if you're voluntarily electing to create someone who you'll then have to be responsible for, of course you should have a basic training in all of these things. Like if someone was in a care home looking after children or elderly people, we'd expect them to have those qualifications. Or if you were going to adopt someone, you go through all this rigorous process. So why should someone who wants to have a biological child just be able to lean into some laissez-faire, Wild West? I can have a kid whenever I want, and to hell with the consequences. So yeah, I don't think procreation should be banned. Of course, that would be very authoritarian. But if someone wants to voluntarily go down the road of having a child, then I think they should be made to undergo some course where they're um, provided some level of competency for actually raising that child.
Yeah,
If
that's
that makes
interesting.
sense.
That's
Would that be
interesting.
would that make procreation licensable?
Sorry, say that again. Would it make
Would
it?
that make it licensable, like a driver's license, like you have to go through and do your test and you
So
pass the test and therefore
yeah.
you're able to have children?
So this is why I don't know exactly how it should be implemented. So I am very wary of like a license approach, because I think that's also very authoritarian. Because it's like,
Yeah.
if someone doesn't qualify for the license, what are you going to do? Like forcibly sterilize them? I'm like not in support of forcibly sterilizing people. So I think that um, there shouldn't be like any form of, if someone goes to, if someone has a child um, and doesn't do this course or fails the course, I don't think they should go to prison or anything like that. Maybe
No.
maybe it would be something like, you know if you have a child and don't do the course, or maybe like you get a 1% increase in your income tax or something like that. So it's also proportional to income, so it won't disproportionately impact poor people. um, that's maybe one way you could do it. I don't know, like I'm not a public policy expert. I can also see how like someone could then say, oh well, if you financially penalize someone for not doing the course, then they're going to have less money to be able to provide the child with, so it's like that could have a negative impact on the child. That's a completely valid thing to take into consideration. So I don't know if there is a perfect way for it to be implemented. Maybe the best way forward would simply be have that course freely available to anyone, make it as easy to access as possible, and it's free. It's paid through tax, so I guess it's not free, but it's free at the point of use. um Maybe that's the best way to go about it, because then if it's free and easy, you'd hope that most people are responsible enough that, knowing they're going to be a parent, they would want to do that course.
Yeah.
um Maybe that's the best way to go about it, and not have any form of like coercion. um
Maybe
Ultimately, I don't know, but yeah.
just throwing it
I
out there, but
understand.
you could even sorry, Robert, you could even justify a small tax break to someone who would complete a course like that, given that there would be less consumption of child protection services, less consumption potentially on the NHS. If
Yeah.
those kind of you could make the argument, I think, to giving someone an incentive to complete a course like that. And I think somehow down the line we have abdicated our responsibility towards our children. Um,
Mm.
I I don't know if it's a problem related to modernity or to, I don't know. There seems to be this thing where kids are pumped out and not given the proper, the proper experience that they should have as a kid. I would fully advocate for families around the UK to start home cooking, spending more time doing, parents helping out and being present in things like homework. I just don't think, just observing the UK that we do those things.
Yeah. Well, do you remember, there was one news story that I saw, I think it was a few months ago now, maybe like 6 months, that made me just like my mind boggle. So you might remember there was a news story about, I don't know if it was one school or multiple schools that had started teaching children how to brush their teeth
Oh no, don't tell
because
me
there were,
this was a thing.
yeah, because there were so many children with dental
Yeah.
issues. Now, my instant reaction to this, and maybe I'm being uncharitable, maybe this isn't the right reaction to have, but my instant reaction was, what are the parents doing? If it like it's a basic thing, teaching your child how to brush your teeth. If you're going to elect to have a child and you're not even equipped to teach them how to brush their teeth, then what business is of yours to create the child in the first place? And yeah, that just like, that was staggering to me. I agree with you. I think people, not in all cases, but it also seems to me like there are many people out there that don't take the due consideration and responsibility towards parenting that they should do. And
Which that
yeah,
shocks me. It shocks me as a parent. I can't think of anything worse.
Yeah,
yeah,
well, I was going to bring up my experience when I had my child. We had a health visitor come,
Yeah.
and the health visitor said like, "Oh, can you show me how you swaddle your child, and can you show me where she sleeps, and how do you put her to sleep?" And you do know that when you bathe the child, you don't leave the child in the bath on its own.
yeah,
And again, I'm like, who's this for? What's this educational thing for? Because it was really condescending,
yeah, yeah.
and
Did you
and
feel?
then
Did you feel,
no, no,
Robert?
no, go on.
I was just going to say, did you feel an element of nanny state, like there was some sort of invasion of
No,
your privacy?
no, no, no. I felt like I was back at primary school, and I thought,
Yeah.
when at the moment she left, I was like, I had a sudden realization. Was like, some people, there's a group of people out there that need this, who'd be
Yeah,
sitting
yeah,
there rather intently saying, "Oh, you don't leave your child um in the bath itself. You don't run the bath at full heat, and then just pop
yeah.
them in. You don't do that." So that's really bad. And as you say, it'd be a great idea if you were 2 or 3 months pregnant, then you get access to a course where you learn how to be a parent.
Mm,
Because again, on the other side, it was wild.
Which is
yeah,
crazy
yeah.
because they give you like birthing classes and what have you. You can attend
Mm,
classes where they stick you on they stick your missus on a bouncy ball. What are they called? Exercise ball. And they
Yoga
get
ball.
them yoga ball. Thank you.
Lamaze
Yeah.
classes as
And
well.
yeah, and they do all sorts of movements and get things moving to help alleviate the discomfort with pregnancy and what have you. But there's no classes afterwards.
Mm,
It's crazy. It's crazy, especially given that I observe that there's kind of a social crisis when it comes to raising our nation's kids.
mm.
I would tend to agree with you, but I would see that not so much as an antenatal policy, but more of a
No.
pro-family policy, if I'm honest. Or
Yeah, I guess you could frame it as a pro-family policy. I would probably frame it more as like a
response.
pro-responsible parenting
Yeah,
policy.
yeah. I was about to
But
say that.
yeah, I mean, yeah, if you wanted to frame it as a pro-family policy, it would maybe make my eye twinge a bit, but like at the same time, it's the policy that matters rather than the label you give it.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I agree. Well, that was very interesting. I was pleased to hear that it wasn't mass vasectomies that are mandated by some sort of authoritarian state. That brought a smile to my face. It
Yeah,
was
yeah.
more how do we educate people, which seems, if I'm analysing this correctly, it seems healthy. We want
Mm,
we want people to raise kids correctly, and I would totally be up for that. And suddenly it doesn't seem quite so. I don't want to offend you here, Lawrence, but it doesn't seem quite so evil.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and suddenly it's within the realms of, well within the realms of normality.
Well,
I think
exactly. And sorry, go on.
no, no, I was going to say I think we're in a rather privileged position to say we do lead quite good lives, and we're able to source that to our kids. I'd imagine if you had like children who are in war-torn states, it would be a different story, and they'd be saying, "Well, maybe I wish." So we almost might be the wrong people to be bringing it about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, what I was just going to say was that I think a lot of people have the initial reaction to antinatalism that it is like an evil thing, or a sort of very negative thing. And I can completely understand that reaction that people have, because like I said before, it's seen as like attacking something that some people see it as just outright attacking children, which is not what it's doing, but people see it as like attacking something that produces children, which I guess it is, right? And because children are seen in such a positive light, which I think they should be, like once they exist, um, people sort of perceive it as inherently negative because it's attacking something they see as inherently positive. So I can understand why people have that initial reaction. Um, Obviously, I would say to them, spend some time thinking about it, consider it, listen to the different voices, and you'll come to a more considered conclusion or perspective. One thing that isn't helping is people like Elon Musk and Jordan Peterson, I can't remember if it was on or off the recording that we were talking about, the video I released today, where they've just had a discussion about a whole range of things, and they mention antinatalism for a brief period. And in that conversation, but also in the past, they've both been consistent in basically, like, I see it as like demonizing antinatalists, and yeah, calling them like evil, often just like outright. And I think both of them have like a very malnourished understanding of what antinatalism is and who antinatalists are. And they'll often commit the cherry picking fallacy, which is where you pick the most extreme example of a group and use that to characterize the whole group. Um, and unfortunately, both of those two guys have a very large following. So this sort of unhealthy and ill-informed view of antinatalism can get spread quite far, which I don't think helps. Um, Hopefully, like, as more people become antinatalist and the antinatalists that are here become more public, people will see that actually they are just like normal people that happen to be antinatalist as well. Like, we have a little community of antinatalists in London here, and like pretty much all of us, like 95%, you would have a full conversation with for like 2 hours and have no idea they're an antinatalist, because in all other ways they're just normal people, right? They work jobs, they see their mum on a Tuesday afternoon or whatever, and all of this sort of stuff. They do their weekly shop at Sainsbury's. They just also happen to be an antinatalist. So yeah, I just wanted to say that as well.
No, that's a fair point. And you're right to kind of bring up the kind of knee-jerk reaction, and I think it's perfectly normal given what we're talking about to have a knee-jerk reaction. But it's also important to open a dialogue and really kind of explore the ideas. And as I've just discovered myself, ultimately, you might have a utopia. Not that that's maybe the right word to use, but you appeal in when you're staying up at night, you would think about what the ideal would look like, but you're not giving us a prescription that's going to force us down that road. And actually, for me, the policy that you suggested around educating parents, that seems like a really good idea. And personally, I would advocate us as a species to have more kids. So I'd align myself more with Elon Musk and Jordan Peterson from a kind of an axiomatic perspective that actually having kids is a really good thing. So for me, having larger families is a good thing, but so long on the prerequisite, if you like, that we actually treat them properly, rather than we have a problem with discarding children and raising them incorrectly, or raising them in such a way that they descend to crime and make the UK an unpleasant place for ultimately for everyone, or actually just the world in general. It seems to be, it can be a dark place, but it can also be a beautiful place. I think you'd argue that as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Interesting stuff. So on my list of questions, my next one was, it kind of ties in with something that you mentioned earlier, that you're obviously you admit to being a vegan as well as an antinatalist, but is there and that kind of makes sense, there's kind of like an ethical thread that ties them together, but is there, in the community, is there any other kind of ideas, politics, leanings that are shared amongst the community? Is there a tendency to lean to the left or the right? Is there a tendency to be somewhat nihilistic in a if that makes sense? Or I hope I've explained myself adequately.
So the first thing I would say, and I think this was just like I don't think there was any intention behind you using this word, but I would hesitate to use the word admit being vegan, because I think an admission is about something being negative.
Shared. We'll say shared.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah,
it wasn't intentional.
No, I know. To be honest, I've actually had that before where people have used the word admit in that context. In terms of like overlapping beliefs within like antinatalism, so there are a few which are pretty common. So veganism is a pretty common overlapping belief. I don't know if it's the majority of antinatalists. I'm actually not sure. So one thing is that the antinatalist world is like very under researched. So there are basically no surveys trying to detail who the antinatalist community are, what do they believe, this sort of stuff. There are some rudimentary sort of attempts at that, but nothing like peer reviewed or anything like that. To my knowledge anyway. If people do know, then please let me know. But from my experience, veganism is a big overlap. Support for assisted dying or the right to die is a big overlap as well. Atheism, there are religious antinatalists. There are groups of like Christian antinatalists or Buddhist antinatalists, or other religions as well. But I would say the majority tend to be atheists. In terms of nihilism, so
I only threw out nihilism as an idea that, obviously you've probably understood that there's a bit of a preloading there. I already have a conception, and I know that the two are different, right? And I know that obviously you're probably going to reject the premise that you're a nihilist.
Well, no. So in one respect I am, one respect I'm not. So in my understanding, there are two forms of nihilism. So one form of nihilism says nothing matters, in terms of like moral nihilism. I can do what I want, nothing matters anyway. Antinatalists aren't that, because obviously antinatalists are antinatalists because they care about something. So almost by definition, they're not moral nihilists. But I would say it is very common for antinatalists to be existential nihilists, in that they think there's no ultimate purpose to the universe, which often goes hand in hand with atheism. So maybe, that's kind of like one in the same with atheism. In terms of like political beliefs, I haven't noticed any patterns. Like there are very left-wing antinatalists that, you would, card-carrying communists, but you would also find antinatalists that are also like anarcho-capitalists, and a whole variety of political beliefs in between. There are antinatalists with more libertarian leanings. There are some with more authoritarian leanings. It really depends on the person. There may be some like overall trends, but I just don't know them because the studies haven't been done.
Yeah, okay. And anything that you would understand would literally just be anecdotal at this point.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, all right. That's fair enough. It was, it's interesting that there's some shared ideas. It's almost as if it beggars the question of, should we have a survey done of the community? Yeah. It was interesting because it was my observation when I was looking through the subreddit that it was full of very vegan posts, a lot of people in some sort of conflict whether or not veganism and
Yeah.
antinatalism were, kind of these conflicting ideas. Some of the people are saying
Yeah.
yes, of course it is. Some people are saying no.
Yeah.
So it seems that there's a debate very much around veganism and antinatalism.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, I actually don't spend any time on Reddit, so I'm not completely familiar. I'm not
You're
completely
better off.
familiar with. Yeah, I'm not completely familiar with the antinatalist subreddit, but this like conflict over veganism is, very long-standing and divisive. So yeah, I'm not surprised that it's on there.
What's the contention? I really didn't understand at this point because we were
Yeah.
getting into a quite an esoteric. I'm not a vegan. I'm not an antinatalist, so it's almost as if you're talking Chinese to me. But if
Yeah.
you could normalize it for me or make it normie proof, that would be great.
So the basic contention that it is, somewhat more complex than this, but the basic contention is, if you don't want to create humans because they can be harmed and they can suffer, why would you want to be responsible for creating animals who can also suffer and be harmed? And actually, the lives of animals are generally much worse than humans because humans aren't in factory farms, right? Or laboratories, whereas, most animals are in factory farms across the world. So that's the main contention: is if you're not bringing humans into existence by procreating, why would you bring animals into existence by paying for meat, dairy, eggs, etc.? That's the basic contention.
But okay, so where does the crowd that disagrees fit in?
As in, you mean what is their argument against it?
Yeah, why would they be? It kind of feels like there is an ethical thread, as I mentioned before, between the two. There's a logic there for me. It seems like it's grounded. So
Yeah.
what would be the contention? Yeah, what would be the counter argument?
So I'm not one of these people, so I'm not going to be able to put it forward as good as they will because I don't
Of
believe it.
course.
Like I think their arguments are shit, basically. Um, but I have done a video on my channel called Animals in Antinatalism, which goes into this in depth. But on a basic level, generally they either tend to define antinatalism in a very weird way where it can only apply to humans. And I just think then they're basically, I think the term is gerrymandering, where they try to come up with like a very weird definition so that it excludes certain uncomfortable things that they don't like or don't want to accept. Um, some also just reject that animals have moral value. They just say, animals don't, or they don't reject that animals have moral value, but they say they can't suffer in the ways that are relevant. So some people will say, yes, animals can suffer, but they can't existentially suffer. Humans can, think about the future and have anxiety over it, or they can have anxiety over the fact that, things about the universe and stuff like this, whereas animals can't, and that to me is not convincing because why should that be the only form of suffering we take into account? Sure, a pig can't think about 10 years time, but if they're being stabbed in the throat, they can feel that just as much as if you're being stabbed in the throat. They have the same pain receptors. Their central nervous system is, similar enough for us to be able to assume that they feel pain, at least that visceral form of pain, in pretty much the same way. So yeah, their arguments aren't convincing to me, and I probably haven't characterized them in the best way because I just I don't hold that position. But those those are sort of some examples.
Okay, all right, that makes sense. It was just a curiosity. Let's put it that way.
Mm.
Cool. I mean, the last question that I had for you, actually, Robert, this is your one, mate. Do you want to take it away for us? I'll butcher it otherwise.
Yes,
Pardon the pun.
yes. It was a question. So we've talked about life. What about artificial life? Do you think we should carry on humanity with artificial life that would possibly take us over? Where does that fit?
Yeah. So I think basically the same moral issues with procreation carry over to creating sentient AI. So if AI is truly, if AI becomes truly sentient, then it would have an experience like us. It just wouldn't have the biological suit that we have, right? It would be contained in some sort of digital or metallic suit, or I don't know what it would look like. But if it's sentient, it would have somewhat of a similar experience in that it can it can experience positive and negative states and things like this. So the same arguments would apply in that, just as I would say for someone not to create a human through birthing them, I would say don't create a sentient AI through, I don't know, creating this line of code or whatever. It's much more counterintuitive because we've obviously evolved to be much more understanding of like biological beings. But I think the same ethical issues would apply. There are a few like ethical wrinkles in that that kind of make it slightly different in the direction of it actually being maybe slightly worse. So one is that when you're creating biological beings, there's at least some like built-in time delay between when you can create them, because there's a gestation period, right? So humans
Yeah.
can create, one human, and then there's the pregnancy. Then there's some time after the pregnancy where you'll have to conceive again, and then there's there's the next pregnancy. So it's not like you can have a kid and then the next day you can have another one. Whereas if you were to create a sentient AI, at least in theory, it may be just as easy as like producing them in a factory or copy and pasting them like a piece of software. So then that would remove that delay time, which seems like it would be worse, because you could create the same amount of beings in a shorter amount of time. Another issue is that just as we see certain AIs that are trained to play chess, for example, you know we can design AIs so that they are super intelligent, that they are much better than humans at a specific task, and no human is going to be as good as this artificial intelligence. It may also be true that we could design an AI so that they're much more capable of suffering than humans as well. It may be true that and it may be true of happiness as well. So it may be the case that we could create an AI, if we can create sentient AI, that could suffer to a much higher degree than humans. So those are sort of two sort of wrinkles that make it slightly more complicated or different, shall I say, than human reproduction. But yeah, fundamentally the same ethical issues apply.
That's interesting. So I work in tech, and I've always been fascinated by the question of AI since I can remember. Being a kid, it's something I used to find fascinating. Like the story of Hal from is it 2001: Space Odyssey?
Yes.
Hal indeed. Yeah, this malevolent sort of force. Not that I see AI being that way inclined, but I always saw, though, and this is perhaps where my philosophical kind of, I'm trying to explain myself here. It's kind of where things start to fall apart for me a little bit, is that I always see AI as being an imitation, as being a machine that's been given the characteristics to appear like a human, to the point where we can't tell the difference. So for me, the philosophical argument is interesting, but it's still just a lump of metal and silicon at the end of the day. So for me, I find
it's always written though. It's always written by, and ultimately it's a human writer. They always write that the AI gets to such a sentience where it realizes that humanity is the ultimate danger, and that's in a lot of media.
that's always the
And
trope,
and
isn't it?
then
Yeah.
the goal is to wipe out humanity.
Yeah, the way
Once
that
they've
it's
achieved
played,
it.
exactly the way it plays out in Hollywood, is that this AI always figures out that we're the biggest threat, even to ourselves. So wipe out humanity.
Even just with simple research as well. I think is that Age of Ultron is probably the best create a sentient being, and then it discovers that we're ultimately savages, and let's get rid of us.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, just to you, Lawrence, the idea that AI, general AI, this is what we're talking about, not the AI we have today, which is really is just an imitation.
Yeah.
Do you find that the argument that a general AI would just be an imitation of us rather than actually being its own entity, its own mind? And I think to answer the question, really, you'd have to really understand the code, which I don't think we're, as human beings, yet ready to even understand what that would look like today. What do you make of that?
Yeah, to be honest, ultimately, I don't know. Like, we don't even understand consciousness fully in biological beings. So,
Yeah,
it would be very difficult for us to make predictions about whether consciousness or sentience can even arise in digital beings, or digital beings can arise. So yeah, to be honest, I have no idea. I'm not well informed enough. To be honest, at this stage, I don't think anyone is well informed enough to know whether sentience actually could arise. Uh, but yeah, the arguments I'm making are that, in theory, if it could arise, then these ethical issues would be at play. But in
gotcha.
terms of whether they will just become extremely good at like imitating us, or if they would be actually sentient, and there's no way to distinguish, I sort of lean on the side of like we should then probably give them like the benefit of the doubt and take them into consideration ethically. Because I don't know if you guys have heard the saying, like, it's better to have a gun and not need it than to not have a gun and need it. Um, I guess it's kind of the same principle of like, it's better to take them into ethical consideration and not needed to, rather than not take them into consideration and have needed to, and then you've done something awful.
Of course, no,
But
I
yeah,
totally, yeah, I totally get what you're saying, and I would broadly agree with you. Yeah, it's
yeah,
better. It'd be better to
but it
consider
is
them
very
as
difficult.
life.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is a
I've
difficult.
heard that. I've heard that saying expressed as it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, very good.
Yeah, I think actually the version that I used, I got from the first Alien versus Predator film. So that shows you where I get my information from.
Fantastic.
Brilliant pop culture references. Love it,
Yeah.
love it. Um, Look, Lawrence, we've reached the end of our questions that we prepared. Um, but I had, for me personally, there was one last thing I wanted to kind of get across to you is that
Mm,
you've come across the analogy, the saying that it's better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all.
mm,
And for me, that's literally the way that I feel about life itself. That it's better for me, it's better to have had a life than to have never had a life before.
Yeah.
And
mm,
so I'm immensely grateful. I'm immensely, profoundly grateful that my mum and my dad decided to have me. In the same way that I hope my kids will feel that way about us.
mm.
Um, so where does that leave you with that idea that life is precious and we, in my view, I'm not prescribing it, but in my view,
Mm,
we should go out into the world and make beautiful babies.
mm. Yeah, so I think the first thing to make clear is that there is simply no one in existence to want to be created, right? There's no one there who wants to come into existence. And to
Agreed.
give an
Yeah.
example of like, if we go back 200 years, none of us three existed and we didn't care. We didn't exist to care that we weren't born, right? It's only now that we're created that we have this love for life and all this sort of stuff. So I agree with you. Like, we should cherish the things we have once we're here, but that is not a reason to create someone, because there just simply isn't someone there who wants to be created. And when you say, better like love and lost than not love at all, um, we've got to remember that uh, when that phrase is kind of, it's applied to ourselves, right? Because we
Yeah.
choose to go out and find love with, knowing there's the risk of losing it again. But when we're creating someone, we're not going to be the losers. We're imposing that risk of loss onto someone else. So I believe there's a fundamental difference there.
Oh,
Um,
totally.
yeah.
I'm totally with you that fundamentally there's a difference. It's just I don't know how to vocalize this. This is the shortcoming of my brain and my education. I
Mm,
don't know. For me it would be a great shame to let everything go.
mm.
Despite all the bad, it's still precious somehow.
Yeah, and I can completely understand that way of seeing it. For me, I have and I don't use this term in any like demeaning way or whatever, but I see that as like a sentimental reaction to the topic, and I have the same sentimental
Mhm.
reaction of like, you know, I have an attachment to humanity and individuals in humanity and the creations of humanity in terms of art and music and stuff like this, just as much as the next man. It's just on an ethical level. I
Yeah.
think it's better if we don't create anyone else. But I completely understand where you're coming from on a sentimental level.
Good. Good. Uh, okay. Unfortunately, I'm not. I won't be able to agree, but I
Well,
w-
I didn't come thinking that I was going to convince a
no.
man with 4 children to join my side.
It's
That
too
would have
late.
that would have made my day and my year. But
It's too late for me, I'm afraid.
exactly, yeah.
Way too late.
Roll back time. Roll back time. Yeah, I had that connection thinking about in preparation to this, driving to work. I had that very visceral connection to my own child, and I did think about what happens if that child wasn't here. And I think my personal view, and it is a personal view, would be I would trade that suffering of myself, um, for the 5 year, 4 or 5 years that I've had with her.
Oh, mate.
Um, yeah, if you if you could go back and somebody would tell you like you would have a child but then you would lose that child, would you still go ahead with it? I think
Or
probably
mm,
not at the time, but knowing what I know now, it would be very much yes.
Mm.
Whether that be completely selfish or not, I think I would trade that. Yeah.
I'd be tempted to make a
Uh,
deal with the devil to swap places so my kids get to survive, but I cease to exist.
yeah, yeah. Well, it wasn't a pleasant drive to work. I can tell you
No,
it was
that sounds like
really
a teary
emotional.
drive. Yeah.
Yeah, it was. It was.
Mm.
But that's where I stand on that. And yeah, I probably came into the call thinking similar feelings that I'm going to completely reject this. But from a humanitarian point of view, at a higher level, a lot of it makes sense.
Mm.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the arguments. Well, I'm not in a position to argue. I'm really not. But it does
Mhm.
appear that the ethical arguments are fairly watertight. But I don't know if I'm the right person to comment. However, there does feel like there is I don't know, a mystical aspect to humanity that's worth saving.
Mm.
Anyway, I'm not going to convince you, Lawrence. I know that. Um, but there you go. No, I'll tell you what though. It was a very
Yeah.
interesting conversation, and I
Mm.
wholeheartedly
Okay.
appreciate your time. Really,
No,
truly.
and thank you, one, for having me on, but also exploring the topic, because I think the more people like you guys who can come at this topic, even if you disagree, but from a good faith perspective and just want to explore it, the better,
Yeah.
and there is common ground that we can share. Often if someone said put an antinatalist and a parent in a room, you'd assume they would not agree on anything, but we've actually, come to some agreement on, things like improving education and stuff like this. Um,
Of course.
so yeah, I would just, thank you for being open-minded, because not everyone is, especially the fact that you're both coming at it from a position of already having had children.
Good, good, and I'm pleased to hear that you find that we've come in good faith, and I think that's something that we strive for. That's for
Mm,
us an incredibly important aspect to what we are embarking on. So
mm.
that's really good to hear, and of course
Mhm.
we agreed on a lot, which I was pleasantly surprised.
Mm.
Fantastic. Well, let's put an end to it there. It was again amazing. Thank you very much for your time. Very much appreciated, and hopefully we can keep the dialogue open.
100%. Thank you so much for having me on.
Alrighty. Cheers,
Yep,
lads.
thank you.